Hi, welcome to Board Gems. This is my regular video series, 3rd, 13th, and 23rd of the month, in which I go over an older board game gem. This game that I'm covering in this episode is an oldie. I think it originally came out in 1971, back when 3M was making games. Don't you miss the days, I mean, this is even before my time, but don't you miss the days in which a company would just make whatever? Like 3M did. 3M made literally everything, including board and card games. And the game I'm talking about in this episode is Sleuth. Now, this was designed by Sid Sackson, and if there was a Mount Rushmore of board game designers, Sid Sackson definitely needs to be one of the four, along with Alex Randolph, and we'll probably have to have a debate about the last two, but those two for sure. So like I said, this was originally put out by 3M in their... They used to have like a small series of card games. I think they were called gamettes. And there were a few different formats. Like there was like one that looked like kind of like a butter dish. You know, it kind of had like a cover that came off like a butter dish cover. Do people still have butter dishes? But they also came in these like clamshell ones that you could just open up and there's cards in there. And I think those were pretty small games. So after 3M, I mean, Avalon Hill, I think, did Sleuth back in the 80s. And then in the maybe early 2000s, Face to Face did some Sid Sackson games, including Sleuth. And most recently, Eagle-Gryphon games. And this edition is from Eagle-Gryphon. They've had at least 2 printings, I think, of this. I will say I love it when newer editions, like this is not an old game, like an old printing. This was probably at most 5 years ago, this one, I would say. But it still harkens back to the old artwork from the very first editions, with kind of the Sherlock Holmes type, but with the plaid. It's a very kind of, I don't know, 60s, 70s aesthetic, and they kept it, which I always appreciate it when they have newer editions of older games that kind of keep some of the older aesthetics of the older editions. Believe it or not, this actually started as a board game. The Case of the Elusive Assassin. Maybe that's based on a mystery novel. And the idea was it would have a board that you could move around, like a 6x6 board, and each space had like 3 different qualities to it. North, south, east, or west, or whether it was urban or rural or industrial, or whether it had forest or mountains or lakes. And there were roads connecting them, and you literally move your pawn from space to space in order to ask questions. Well, Sleuth is basically the card game version of that game. It takes those 36 spaces on the board and makes 36 unique cards, and you take one out at the beginning of the game, and then you ask questions of each other, very structured questions based on other cards in the deck, to the other players in order to deduce what is the missing card, the missing gem in this case. It's for 3 to 7 players. Now, it works for all that player range. If you play by the rules, a 3-player game is going to be crazy, crazy easy. Like, you're going to blow through that in 15 minutes probably. Maybe somebody will get lucky. There are variants, which I'll talk about later, which can make the game more challenging. You probably want 4 or 5 players. That's probably best. 6 or 7 absolutely works. But you see, because the remaining information, the information that's not set aside, and that's what you're trying to deduce, everything else is split up among the players. So when you have more players, not only will it take more turns to come around to you, I mean, you're learning things on other people's turns as well, as you'll see. But also, you need to ask more questions because the information is spread out among more people, if that makes sense. So 6 or 7 players, the game can be very, very challenging. And 3 players is probably too easy, but it's easy to add some variants to make it harder. 4 or 5 is probably the sweet spot. The box says ages 10 and up, probably pretty fair. And the range says 30 plus minutes. Yeah, that plus is doing a lot of heavy lifting. A 3-player game can be over in under 30 minutes, but a 7-player game can go well over an hour. But anyway, let me show you how it plays, and I'll talk more about why it's a gem. To set up the game, give each player a note sheet, and you'll notice there's 36 boxes. Each box corresponds to one combination of 3 elements. There are 4 colors. There are 3 types of gems: diamonds, opals, and pearls. And there's numbers of gems, which in this game they call solitaires, pairs, and clusters. This deck has 36 cards, 1 for each combination. So you'll see red, pearl, solitaire would be this one. Green, diamond, pair would be that one. You're going to shuffle up this deck of cards and set aside one face down nearby. Nobody gets to look at it. Your goal, of course, is to guess the missing card. All of the other cards will be distributed among the players. There might be a couple left over. Depending on how challenging a game you want, you can reveal those immediately to give information to everyone, or you can make it even harder by having to guess all of them. It's strongly recommended if you're playing with just 3 players, say. So anyway, each player will look at their cards and secretly mark on their sheet that those cards are obviously not the secret one. Like, I've seen this one, I've seen this one. And then they keep those handy. So this is the search deck. You're going to shuffle this up and give each player a hand of 4 cards. You actually deal out the cards face up. So every player has 4 cards that everyone else can see. And they will be some combination of the elements. There are 1 element cards, in this case opals or reds. There are 2 element cards, so in this case red diamonds, it mentions 2 elements, color and type. And there are free choice. There are also free choice ones that have an element pre-printed on them. So free choice solitaires, for example. Players are trying to guess the card that is face down. There are other cards that might be face up, leftover cards. Everybody can mark those down, but you're trying to guess the 1 or more hidden cards. And to do that, you're going to play these cards. When your turn comes, you take one of your 4 cards, play it to the middle of the table into a middle discard pile. The remaining cards can go in the middle as well as a draw pile. But you're going to have a discard pile in the middle. And you're going to pick one of your cards, discard it to the middle, pick one other player around the table, and ask the question on the card to that player. So there's 2 types of questions. There's the 1 element question, red or opals, and there's 2 elements, like red diamonds. If you play a 1 element card, in this case reds, you pick another player and you ask them how many red cards they have. The other player says out loud how many red cards that they have. And of course they have to answer truthfully. But this is public information. They say it out loud. All players hear how many red cards they have. If you play a 2 element card like red diamonds, something else happens. You also pick a player and you ask them about their red diamonds. And they will announce out loud how many red diamonds they have, but they will also give them to you secretly for you to look at, so you know which ones. So all players get the same information, the number, but in the case of the 2 element cards, the player who asked also gets to see them. The player doesn't get to see them for the 1 element cards. There are free choice cards, which have a little more flexibility in terms of the type of question. Both of them, both types, so one just says free choice and one says free choice and an element, like free choice solitaires or free choice green or free choice opals. You can use either of these cards to ask a 1 or 2 element question, just like these, but you have more flexibility because you get to choose the elements. Free choice, completely open. You can ask 1 element, so you can ask how many diamonds, or how many yellows, or how many clusters. And then the other player would answer the number that they have. But you can also use it as a 2 element. It works the same way as the other two elements. Ask the question, the other player announces the number but also shows you. So you can choose for this to be a 1 element or a 2 element. You can also do the same with this one. The only catch is that one of the 1 or 2 elements has to be solitaires. So if you were to ask a 1 element question, it would have to be solitaires. You'd have to ask how many solitaires a player has. But if you ask a 2 element, you could ask about yellow solitaires, or blue solitaires, or diamond solitaires, or opal solitaires. So again, you have more flexibility than these cards. After you play a card, you then draw a replacement, so you have 4 again. Instead of playing a card, perhaps your cards are kind of bad. They're not asking you questions that you in particular want to know about. Instead, you can skip your entire turn, take all your cards, discard them to the middle, don't ask any questions, and instead draw 4 cards as a replacement. So play is going to continue until one player thinks they can guess or are close to guessing, eliminating on their sheet by making notes, and figuring out which card is the hidden card. If you've figured it out, you can just announce it at any time. On another player's turn, doesn't matter. You can say, I figured it out. If so, circle on your sheet the box that you think it is. I think it's blue diamond clusters, so you would circle this one. And then you secretly look at the card. And if you're right, you announce that you're right. And you've won the game. You can continue. The other players can continue to also try to guess, try to get second place or third place, at which point the winner stays in the game for the purpose of answering questions, but otherwise doesn't play. If the player is wrong in their guess, then they are eliminated. But again, they must keep playing in terms of answering questions from the other players. If you have more than one card face down that you're trying to guess, you have to guess all of them correctly. If even one is wrong, you lose. If you've almost got it figured out, but you just need to ask one more question, then on your turn, instead of playing one of these cards, or discarding all 4, you can ask any question you want to any player. It's as if you had a free choice. You ask any question, 1 element or 2 element, to any other single player you want. They answer, you mark the notes, and then you must guess, circling a box on your sheet. So there's 2 ways you can guess. You can guess just any time, just out of the blue, circle a box and then check. Or if you're close, but maybe 50-50, for example, then you can wait until your turn comes around and ask any question you want, but then you must commit to a guess. And the first player to guess correctly wins the game. That's it. You're ready to play Sleuth. A lot of games I cover for the channel have a quality about them that I appreciate and I like to promote. And that is games that have simple rules but can be thinky. So, for one thing, it's easy to learn. The rules do not create a barrier to entering into it. The thinkiness doesn't come from the complexity of trying to figure out how the rules work and how to navigate them in order to win. The rules are simple, but the resulting game can be thinky. At least it can be as thinky as you want it to be. And Sleuth definitely falls into that category. You can play Sleuth as a casual experience with other players who are taking it casually, and you can play it with more serious gamers, and it supports that. You can track all sorts of information in Sleuth. In the note-taking, you can, record who asked what questions. I mean, part of the game is trying to find opportunities to stumble upon the right answer, right? So if you see that somebody's asking a lot of questions about a certain element, that may be useful information. Maybe you should focus on that element yourself if you have the cards for it. And so you can be as thinky as you want it to be, but you can also play it casually. In fact, when I first learned this game, I learned it incorrectly. I have no one to blame but myself. I must have skipped over that part of the rules because so many games you deal out a hand of cards, and everybody has a hand of cards that they look and they keep secret from other players. And I must have my eyes just must have glazed over that part of the rules and assumed that that was the same thing here, and it's not. In Sleuth, the hand of cards you have, which are the questions you're allowed to ask the other players, are face up. And that's information that you can use. You can see that the next player in turn order has a particular question. You don't know that they're going to ask that question this turn. Maybe they'll ask it later, or maybe they'll ditch it and get a fresh batch of questions. But if they do ask that question, maybe you shouldn't ask a similar question, or maybe you should ask a question that question will give you more info for. So it definitely supports that. But honestly, it's fine if you just have a hand of cards and keep them secret. On your turn, you just play a card, ask the question. And if you want to ensure a casual experience, you can just play that way. There's a few variants in the rules. Doesn't mention that one. That's just one we stumbled upon. Works completely well. Because when you sometimes you have to enforce casualness. When you have a mixed group, a group of casual players and players who take games a bit more seriously, games are a serious business, then if some players are kind of playing by the seat of their pants and they're not tracking every little bit of information, but other players are, those other players have an advantage, right? So it can be useful to be able to enforce in the rules and how it's presented to the players in a way that ensures the seriousness or the casualness is matching up with what you want. So if you're playing with all new players, all casual players, just have a hand of cards. And that's not information that, you can't track. You can't track that this person has this question. You could still track that they ask the question later on if they play it. But, you're kind of enforcing it. Anyway, it works both ways. We learned it with a secret hand, played it a few times, and then later on, when I read the rules again, I was looking something up, I'm like, oh, actually, we got this rule wrong. It's supposed to be face up. We all just kind of looked at each other, and it's like, we don't need to do that. It's hand of cards is fine. But, you can compare it to the Rose King, which is the second board gem that I ever did. So, one of my favorite two-player games. And in that game, you could easily have a hand of cards that you keep secret, but in fact the cards are face up on the table. And having those cards visible to both players is a huge part of the Rose King. And that's what makes that game great, or that's one of the reasons it makes that game great. And I'm sure there are people who will say you absolutely have to play Sleuth with the cards face up. And that's the way to play. And that is in the rules. And that's the way I taught it. Just now in the video. Actually, in my family, in my group, we don't. We don't play by the rules. We just have the secret hand of cards and we just play, and it's more casual. Now, in terms of casualness, you can go too casual because there are some games, and Top Secret Spies, Heimlich & Co. Is a game like this, where the game really benefits, and there's another level if you take notes and you record everything. But there's the temptation among some people in that game to not take notes. I don't want to take notes. I don't want to bother, right? But then halfway through the game, they're like, I have no idea what's going on, and this is boring. Whereas if you were taking notes, you're following along, and it's getting more and more interesting. You're getting more and more info, right? So Sleuth, absolutely, you need to take notes. No doubt about it. You absolutely need to take notes in order to deduce the hidden result. But how many notes to take, that's up to you. You can record a lot of information. And it's really, really important in this game to develop a system, a note-taking system, because there's a lot of information you could track. And if you tried to track it all, you'd probably just make a mess of your sheet and you'd lose track and you're more likely to make a mistake. But everybody's got to come up with their own note-taking system. So certainly if you're intending to play with the same group multiple times, start off as casually as possible. Start off, I would even suggest, with the secret hand of cards. Fewer players, 3 or 4 players to start, and people will breeze through it. It'll be super easy. And then as people get used to it and they've developed their own note-taking system, they've gotten used to the game, then you can add more challenge by either adding the number of players, growing the group, or making the easier games more challenging. And in this game, that's easy to do. So the 3-player game, like I mentioned, is crazy, crazy easy. Like, you may stumble upon the answer in the first 10 minutes. If you are just asking questions randomly, you might just stumble upon it. And one thing they suggest in the rules, and I do recommend this, at least after your first game, is in a 3-player game, don't have just one secret card. Have 2 or even 3. Because there will be that many cards left over. After you've dealt out, I think, 11 cards to each player, there'll be 3 left. And according to the rules, you flip over 2 face up so everybody can see it, and the other one stays face down. That's what we're trying to figure out. But you could leave 2 or even all 3 face down. And it just extends the game. It makes the game longer, but it has more of an arc, right? Okay, I found this one, that's good. Okay, now I'm on to the next one, right? And at the end, when you have to guess, you have to guess all of them right. If even one is wrong, you're wrong. And it's been the case where I've made mistakes in my notes, I've made incorrect deductions, and I thought I had the answer, and I looked at it, and 2 of them were right, and 1 of them was way off. So I would recommend probably in a 3-player game, have 3 hidden cards. And in a 4-player game, have 2 hidden cards. And in a 5-player game, there will only be 1 left over, because you'll deal out the 35 cards. And there'll be only 1 left. So 5 and up, just have the 1 hidden card. And if you want a challenging game, 6 or 7 players, it's going to make the game a lot longer. And of course, it's going to be more challenging because the limit, you start with less information and you have to ask more different people the information. Because you don't ask questions of everybody, you only ask questions of one person. So every question you ask, you're going to get less information from a single player than you are if there were fewer players in the game. It's definitely worthwhile to learn that variant and other variants. So there's 1-element cards and 2-element cards. The 1-element cards feel kind of weak compared to the 2-element. In both, you're getting information about the number of cards involved in the question, but everybody's getting that information. But if you play a 2-element card, you're actually seeing those cards. So having 2-element cards is much better. And I've seen the case where people would have like mostly single element cards because they'll have a mix at the beginning, and then they'll play all their 2 elements, and they're drawing new ones. They're drawing more single elements. They have a handful of single elements, and they're like, skip my turn and get a fresh batch of cards because single elements are strictly worse. Basically, there is a variant in the back of the rule book, an official variant that says you can play up to 2 cards. You can play 1 1-element card and 1 2-element card at most. And you can choose to only play 1 if you want, but you can play up to 2 as long as there are 2 different types, a 1-element and a 2-element, and you target 2 different players with them. And that sounds like a great variant. I actually haven't played that myself. I really should, because we did see that the 1-elements are like, I got a 1-element, that's not very good, right? So that's a really cool variant. And if you want to make the game even more challenging, you can change the 2-element cards. Again, another official variant, in which you don't get to see the cards. Just like the 1-element cards, you only get the number. And that number is public information. Everybody hears that. Experts only for that one. That's super challenging. In an earlier video, I covered a game called Mystery of the Abbey, which is another deduction game. Now, that's a full-on board game. You're moving your pawn around and you're asking questions of the other players. So it's very reminiscent of Cluedo. And in that video, I asked myself, does Mystery of the Abbey fire Clue? And Self replied, no, it doesn't. There's a lot to like about the game, and if you like Clue, you may like Mystery of the Abbey too, but not necessarily, because Mystery of the Abbey is longer. It's a much longer game than Clue, and the questions are less structured. And some people have a hard time with that. Believe it or not, Sleuth does fire Clue. It doesn't have a board. You're not rolling the dice and moving your pawns around, okay? It takes the elements of Clue, like, cards that are taken out, and then you have structured questions, right? Obviously, it's different from Clue in how those questions are structured, but it really feels a lot like the best elements of Clue and none of those bad elements, which Clue does have. So honestly, I mean, I don't mind Clue. There's like 1,000 other games I'd played before Clue, but if my best friends ever got together and I was, hanging around with them, we were having a great time, and they all wanted to play Clue, I wouldn't go sit in a corner or something. Yeah, I'll play, right? But I would never feel like I had to play Clue if I could play Sleuth instead. This absolutely replaces Clue. If you're a fan of Clue, you should definitely check this game out. And it shouldn't be too hard to find. There's lots of used copies around, and I think there's still new copies out there for sale. So if you're a fan of deduction games or you're a fan of Clue, because they're not necessarily the same thing, but either way, check out Sleuth. It's a great board gem. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games, old games like Sleuth don't stop being good just because new games come out. Take care.